The morning I got fired, the executives at my company believed they had just saved themselves $4 million. By the time the sun disappeared behind the skyline that evening, they had accidentally created a disaster worth more than $6 million, destroyed 2 powerful careers, and handed me the most satisfying lesson in corporate justice I had ever witnessed. The strange part is that none of it happened because I was a genius or some master strategist. It happened because years earlier, I had done something almost nobody in corporate America bothers to do. I had read every single word of my contract. My name is Victoria Hayes. And for nearly 20 years I worked in the financial services industry. I had spent most of my career helping companies grow, managing relationships with major clients and generating revenue that kept executives smiling during shareholder meetings. At Sterling Capital Group, I wasn't just another executive sitting in a corner office. I was one of the company's top performers. My division had delivered growth quarter after quarter, even during difficult market conditions. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, I had closed the largest client agreement in company history, a deal expected to bring in nearly $30 million over the next several years. That success made what happened next even more confusing. The first warning sign appeared when I walked through the front doors of headquarters. On a Tuesday morning, normally, the receptionist greeted me with a cheerful smile and a quick conversation about whatever was happening around the office. That day she barely glanced in my direction. Her eyes remained fixed on her computer screen, as if looking at me would somehow get her into trouble. I immediately felt something was wrong. Before I even reached the elevator, my phone vibrated with an email marked urgent. The message was unusually short. Mandatory performance review. Conference room 5B. 15 minutes. No explanation. No details. No sender signature. I stared at the screen while a cold feeling settled into my stomach. After 20 years in business, instincts become sharper than most people realize. You learn how to read rooms before you enter them. You learn how to recognize hidden agendas from a single email. Most importantly, you learn when people have already made a decision before a meeting even begins. As I walked toward my office, several employees suddenly became very interested in avoiding eye contact. One manager I had personally mentored for years saw me coming and immediately disappeared into a copy room. Another quickly turned down a hallway. Nobody wanted to speak to me. That was when I knew someone had already decided my future. The problem was that none of it made sense. My department was thriving. Revenue numbers were exceeding expectations. Client retention rates were the highest in the company. Investors were happy. Shareholders were happy. The board had publicly praised my performance only weeks earlier. There was absolutely no legitimate reason for an emergency review, unless the meeting wasn't actually about performance. I entered my office and quietly closed the door behind me. Inside my desk sat a locked drawer that contained copies of every employment agreement I had ever signed. Most executives never look at their contracts again after signing them. I wasn't one of those people. The previous year, during a particularly intense contract negotiation, I had insisted on several protective clauses. At the time, some executives complained that the language was unnecessary. Others rolled their eyes and called it excessive. I called it preparation. I opened the drawer, removed the contract, and carefully flipped through the pages until I found the section I wanted. Clause 14B. Still there. Still signed. Still legally enforceable. A small smile appeared on my face. For the first time that morning I felt calm. I slipped the contract into my portfolio and headed toward conference room 5B. The moment I opened the door, I knew exactly what kind of meeting it was. The blinds were closed. No laptops were open. No reports were on the table. No presentation materials had been prepared. Waiting inside were Karen Mitchell from Human Resources and 2 additional HR representatives who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Karen offered a rehearsed smile but never reached her eyes. "Victoria, thank you for coming." I remained standing. "Of course." She cleared her throat and glanced at the papers in front of her. "After a recent restructuring review, the company has decided to eliminate your position effective immediately." There it was. No discussion, no warning, no explanation, just termination. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Karen was clearly waiting for a reaction. Most people cry. Some get angry. Others try to negotiate. Instead, I simply nodded. Understood. The surprise on her face was impossible to miss. "That's all?" she asked. I removed my company badge and placed it on the table. "Is there anything else?" The entire meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. 20 years of loyalty reduced to a scripted conversation and a stack of paperwork. But while Karen believed she had just ended my career, she had actually triggered something far more expensive. What she didn't know was that my executive equity package was scheduled to vest the following day. And what nobody in that room remembered was Clause 14B. That clause existed for one reason: to prevent companies from firing executives right before compensation events in order to avoid paying them. If the company terminated me without documented cause within 24 hours of a vesting date, the normal compensation package wouldn't disappear. It would accelerate. Bonuses, equity, salary multipliers, additional protections, potential damages, everything. Instead of saving millions, they had just guaranteed an even larger payout. When the meeting ended, I didn't go to the parking garage. I went directly to the legal department. There I found Ethan Reynolds, an attorney who had worked alongside me during several major negotiations over the years. The moment he saw me carrying my portfolio, he knew something was wrong. "Victoria, what happened?" "I've been terminated." His expression immediately changed. "What reason did they give?" "Restructuring." He stared at me for several seconds before motioning for me to sit down. I opened my portfolio, removed the contract, and slid it across his desk. "Read Clause 14B. He scanned the page. Then he read it again. Then a third time. The color slowly drained from his face. "Oh no." I leaned back in my chair. "They triggered it, didn't they?" He closed the document and rubbed his forehead. "They absolutely triggered it." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan sighed deeply. "They were trying to save money." "I know. They just cost themselves millions." "I know." Within minutes, he began forwarding emails, reviewing documentation, and notifying senior legal staff. Unlike most people in my situation, I wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is emotional. Contracts are mathematical. And mathematics doesn't care about excuses. It doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't care about executive mistakes. A signed agreement is a signed agreement. Before leaving the legal department, I made one final stop. A young compliance analyst named Olivia Brooks worked nearby. Years earlier, I had mentored her during her internship program. She had become one of the brightest legal minds in the company. I handed her a copy of the documentation. "Take a look." A few minutes later, her eyes widened. "They fired you inside the protection window." "Yes." She looked down at the signatures. Karen approved these amendments herself. "Every page." Olivia slowly shook her head. "They have no idea what they've done." I looked toward the executive floor visible through the building's glass walls. By that point, I suspected they were about to find out. And when they did, panic would spread faster than any market crash I had ever seen. By lunchtime, the executive floor looked like a building in the middle of a fire drill. Office doors were opening and closing nonstop. Assistants rushed between departments carrying documents and messages. People who normally ignored legal details were suddenly demanding copies of contracts. Karen Mitchell was in full panic mode. According to several employees, she spent the entire morning digging through personnel files, email archives, and performance records. She was desperately searching for anything that could justify firing me. The problem was simple. There was nothing to find. My performance reviews were spotless. I had never received a warning. No complaints existed. No disciplinary actions existed. Sterling Capital had terminated one of its highest performing executives less than 24 hours before a major compensation event. Then things became even worse. The legal department reviewed my contract. Then outside attorneys reviewed it. Then the compensation committee reviewed it. Every group reached exactly the same conclusion. The company was trapped. Clause 14B wasn't vague. It wasn't open to interpretation. The language was crystal clear. It had been properly drafted, properly signed, and directly applied to my situation. Late that afternoon, an email arrived from the board's lead attorney. The message was brief and carefully written. The board had received my documentation and launched an immediate review. That told me everything I needed to know. If they believed they had an easy defense, the tone of that email would have been very different. Meanwhile, emergency meetings were taking place all over headquarters. According to several people inside the company, CEO Marcus Bell initially brushed the issue aside. He insisted I was bluffing. He claimed the company had acted before the vesting date. His confidence lasted until legal counsel walked into his office with my contract. They reviewed the timeline minute by minute. The clause existed for one reason: to stop companies from firing executives at the last possible moment to avoid paying compensation. The timestamps were undeniable. The signatures were valid. The documentation trail was flawless. Most importantly, Marcus himself had approved the amendment the previous year. When he finally understood what had happened, the room reportedly fell silent. The payout was no longer $4 million. Internal calculations quickly pushed the number above $6 million. Then it climbed even higher. Attorneys added accelerated compensation provisions, equity adjustments, salary multipliers, and potential legal exposure. The board wanted answers immediately. Why hadn't legal been consulted? Why was no cause documented? Why had nobody reviewed the executive contract? Unfortunately, nobody had good answers. Several executives tried arguing that the termination technically happened before the vesting date. That argument failed instantly. Clause 14B had been written specifically to stop that exact tactic. In other words, they had walked straight into the trap the clause was designed to prevent. That evening, I went home and sat quietly for a long time. Friends later asked if I was angry. The truth was different. Most of my anger disappeared within the first hour after the termination meeting. What remained was certainty. I had negotiated contracts for years. I understood how situations like this worked. Once the board reviewed the language, the outcome became a matter of mathematics. Not opinions. Emotions. Just numbers. The following morning, my phone rang shortly after sunrise. The caller was board member Daniel Mercer. His voice sounded exhausted. "Victoria, did you expect this to happen?" I looked out the window before answering. "No. I expected them to honor the agreement." Silence filled the line. Finally, he spoke again. "The board received updated calculations. The exposure is now above $6 million. "I figured," I replied. "Marcus keeps calling it an oversight." "That's unfortunate. Karen says she never fully understood the clause." I couldn't help smiling. She signed every page. Another silence followed. Then Daniel asked the question everyone seemed obsessed with asking. "What do you want?" I smiled. "Nothing. He sounded confused. Nothing. I already have a contract. That was the part nobody seemed to understand. I wasn't negotiating. I wasn't threatening anyone. I wasn't making demands. The agreement already existed. The obligation was already written down. My leverage came from preparation, not confrontation.